Hey guys, Brian from Brian Boas here. One of the most important decisions you're going to make for your boa is what enclosure to keep it in. And there's a number of different options with really no one right or wrong answer. But whatever enclosure you pick, you have to make sure that it can satisfy a number of basic environmental requirements. So today I want to go over those basic environmental requirements. I want to comment on how you can maintain them, whatever your enclosure that you pick. And I'm also going to talk about specific types of enclosures and some of the pros and cons of each. For more videos on all aspects of keeping and breeding boas in captivity, please subscribe to the Brian Boas YouTube channel. A lot of great ideas, and as always, these are free videos, so please subscribe right now. So the way I see it, there's really three main types of reptile enclosures that hobbyists are using for boa constrictors. So first there's the basic rectangular snake cage that can be made of either plastic or wood, and there's a number of commercial manufacturers of these. The next option is the rack system, which also there are a number of commercial manufacturers. And then finally there's the naturalistic vivarium, which attempts to duplicate as closely as possible the natural habitat of the boa constrictor. And each of these solutions has its pros and cons. I'll say a little bit more about that at the end of the video. But of course, we need to make sure that whatever solution you pick, it can meet a number of minimal requirements. And I'm going to cheat a little rather than try to memorize all these. I'm just going to read my list for the camera. So any good solution for a reptile or a boa enclosure requires sufficient space, a good substrate, adequate numbers of hiding places for the boa. You need fresh, clean drinking water. You need a temperature gradient. You need adequate humidity and ventilation. And then finally, you want a cage solution that it makes for easy maintenance and cleaning. And then ideally, you also want a cage solution that's going to be nice to look at and enjoyable for the reptile keeper. As I mentioned, multiple solutions can provide all these requirements. And now I'm just briefly going to go over each requirement and how you can best meet this requirement. The first requirement for your boa cage is an adequate amount of space. Now, a general rule of thumb for determining how much space a snake needs in a cage is to add up the length of the cage by the depth of the cage, and that length should be equal to or greater than the length of the snake. For example, if you have a 4-foot wide or 4-foot long by 2-foot deep boa cage, that's the floor dimensions. 4 plus 2 is 6, so that would be adequate for a snake up to about 6 feet in length. In general, boas are a little less active than most other types of snakes, so you can sometimes get a slightly larger boa in an enclosure that size. And the standard boa cage seems to be about, or it seems to be 4 feet by 2 feet by 1 foot. And you can probably keep a boa up to about 7 feet or so in that size of an enclosure. If you have a larger boa up to probably 8 or 9 feet, you probably would want to get a 6-foot by 2-foot cage by, maybe 15 or 18 inches high. And if you have a really, really big boa, something in the 12-foot or so range, which is quite rare, that one you probably would want to put in an 8-foot cage. Unfortunately, there's a number of manufacturers of these plastic snake cages, and so you shouldn't have a problem finding a commercially available solution. So getting into rack systems, I've actually kept and bred dwarf boas in tubs as small as the Iris CV110 tubs, and the dimensions of that tub are about 20 inches by 40 inches, so 60 inches. So the rule of thumb, you can keep a snake up to about 5 feet in one of those enclosures. And I've kept and bred my dwarf boas, like the crawl key and the Tarahumara boas, in those enclosures. And I've also used the Iris boa tubs, which are 30 by 40 feet, or inches rather, and you can keep a snake up to about 6 feet in length in one of those tubs. A little bit about the height. You can get the standard height snake cage, which is 12 inches high, but that can be a little bit tight when you're reaching in there to try to clean in the back. So you might want to consider a 15-inch high snake cage instead. Maybe a little bit easier to clean and to maintain. The second thing you're going to need in your enclosure is an appropriate substrate, and the substrate, of course, is on the bottom of the enclosure where the snake lies on top of. And I've tried numerous different substrates, and really there's no perfect substrate. Some substrates are better for some applications than others. Everyone has their opinions, but I can tell you there's no perfect substrate, and I've used quite a few. I'm actually going to come out with a video specifically on substrates in the near future, but I'll say, just for the sake of this video, substrates should provide two main functions. They should absorb the waste produced by the snake, and they should also provide a foundation that the snake is going to feel comfortable lying on top of. And with that in mind, there's really two main categories of substrates. You have the paper-based substrates like paper towels and corrugated cardboard and newspaper. And then you have the particulate or wood-based substrates, which are things like aspen chips and coconut chips and other types of wood chips. And in the future, I'll say a little bit more about substrates in my upcoming video. In general, I usually use aspen in most of my enclosures. I use paper towels for babies and for new animals which are in quarantine. For situations requiring high humidity, I use the coconut husk bedding. To ensure the well-being of your snake, you're going to need hiding places. Boas like to have a place to hide. They don't like to be out in the open. They like to be in an enclosed space because it makes them feel safe. And I typically recommend at least 2 hiding places in each enclosure. You want one to be over the hot spot, and you want one to be on the cooler end of your enclosure. And there's a number of different solutions to hiding places. I mean, you can be creative. Typically, I'll use a natural type of hiding place. Most often it's cork bedding, and I use that on one side. And then I also use plastic hiding places quite a bit on the other side. So this is a homemade plastic hiding place. It's actually made out of a little drawer organizer that I got at the dollar store. And I simply cut a little hole, access hole, and it makes a great hiding place for younger boas up to maybe 2 years or so. And in fact, I've seen similar enclosures made of the same type of plastic selling for quite a bit at the pet shops, but you can make this yourself for $1. There's a number of other things you can use to make substrates or to make hiding places. So cat litter pans are good for all but the largest boas. Again, you just cut or melt an access hole. I use a soldering iron to just cut a hole for the snake. This is a oil pan. It's a plastic oil pan, and you can do the same thing. You just cut a little access hole in the front, and it makes a great hiding place for a medium-sized boa. And I got both of these for $1 each at the dollar store. So you want to check out your local dollar store. A lot of great things you can use for boa keeping there. In a pinch, you can even use cardboard boxes, like a cereal box or a cracker box. And that should last for probably a week or 2 until it gets soiled. But cardboard boxes can be used for boa hiding places. Getting back to the cork bark, something else that the cork bark provides, and the reason why I typically will use this in all my enclosures, is it has this really rough surface. And the snakes like the feeling, especially the boas. They want to grip onto something, and when they have this rough surface to grip onto, it makes them feel safe and it gives them a sense of well-being. So using bark or some kind of a natural wood hiding place, I recommend that you have something like this in each of your boas enclosures. It's critical to provide fresh, clean drinking water for your boa at all times. And for this, I use this basic pet bowl. This is probably about 8 inches in diameter or so, and this is fine for up to an adult boa. And then, guess where I got this? The dollar store. It cost $1. For smaller boas, you can get smaller plastic water dishes that are something like 4 inches in diameter or so. You don't need to be fancy and get an expensive water dish. I recommend something that's relatively shallow to prevent the snake from tipping it over. You don't want the snake to flood the cage. But I've never had the snakes tip over this kind of a water dish. As far as the water that you put in there, as long as your tap water is safe for you to drink, it's perfectly fine for your boa. You don't need distilled water or bottled water or anything like that. In fact, your tap water is probably more healthy than bottled water because it has higher standards that it needs to pass. It's just very important that you keep it fresh and clean. You want to change it at least every week, if not twice a week, to keep your boa happy. One of the most critical requirements for your boa's enclosure, of course, is that you provide an adequate temperature range. So in general, for most boas, I recommend that you have a hot spot of about 90 to 92 degrees, and that you have a cool side of the cage, which is about 75 to 80 degrees. And there's a number of ways to do this. I'll just share with you how I do it. In general, I use a lot of these heat tapes or heat pads, and it's all basically the same technology. So this is called a Flex Watt heat tape, and this is a product that comes in a number of different widths. You get an 11-inch width. This is the 6-inch width, and it comes in these big rolls, and you can cut it to however long you want. This is a product that's relatively inexpensive. You set it up yourself with these clips, these little metal clips that you attach a wire to, and you hold it in place with these plastic covers. It's not very difficult to do, but it does take, some handiwork. And in fact, in an upcoming video, I'll probably demonstrate exactly how I set up my Flex Watt heat tape. So if you're not a do-it-yourselfer, you might not want to consider using this stuff. But it works quite well, and it's very reasonably priced. The other option, if you want to use this type of a heating, are these heat pads which come pre-wired. And it's basically the same technology as the Flex Watt, although it's a much more durable. It's a thicker plastic, and you can see it's got the cord already attached, and all you have to do is plug it in. And so this one is called an Ultratherm heat pad. It's made in Scotland, and these are a very high quality one. And there's a few other solutions. I would avoid the ones they sell at the pet shops, though. Those tend to be lower quality and higher price. So just go to your local reptile supply website. Like, I highly recommend the Bean Farm. I've been ordering from them for many years, and very great quality stuff, very reasonably priced. The Bean Farm. A couple other solutions with heating. You can use these heat emitting panels, and basically they're these rectangular panels made of plastic and ceramic material that you can mount to the side of your reptile cage, and they emit heat, and they actually heat the air. You can use heating cable, which is this very long cable that you plug in and it gets warm. I prefer the heat tape or the heat pads to heating cable, just because it's a lot more practical for me to use. As a few other solutions, I would not recommend, for example, using light bulbs or like a ceramic light bulb heat emitter. Those tend to get way too hot, and they also will dry out the enclosure too much. And they also are a fire hazard, so I would stay away from using any kind of bulb to heat your snake cage. It's very, very important when you're using any of these devices, you don't just plug it in and not control the temperature. They get way too hot for boas without a thermostat control. So you need a thermostat. It's mandatory when you're using any of these devices. And you want to basically set your thermostat so that it maintains the hot spot. I have on one end these heat tape set up so that the hot spot within the cage will be maintained at about 90 degrees. And then there's this kind of convection of heat so that the cool side is always about 75 to 80 degrees. The ambient temperature in my snake room is typically about 70 to 75 degrees, but I don't need to heat it any more than that because the tubs and cages will always stay on the cool side about 75 to 80 degrees. And I am constantly checking to make sure, I use this temperature gun to check the temperatures, and if it's too cool or too hot, I'm always tweaking the thermostats. I'm going to have a video in the future where I go over specific types of thermostats, but there's a number of ranges of different prices. On the low end, you can get these for about 20 bucks or so. You can get these Jumpstart, Hydrofarm, heat mat controllers. On the higher end, I typically use a lot of the Herpstat thermostats, the Herpstat 6 especially, which is a pulse proportional thermostat that has a number of different options like doing nighttime temperature drops and other things. And I'll say a lot more about this in my video on thermostats in the future. I just wanted to take a quick break from the caging discussion and show you one of my favorite boas, since I haven't shown you any snakes yet in this video. This is a 4.5-year-old holdback Bacopa Peruvian true red-tailed boa. And what's unique about this guy is he has these peaked saddles, which you rarely see peaked saddles in a Peruvian boa. They're more common in Suriname boas. This is one of the few animals that I've actually named, and because of the shape of his saddles, I call this guy Batman. And Batman is just reaching sexual maturity. In fact, I have him paired up this year for the first time, and I have my fingers crossed for some beautiful baby Peruvian boas sometime this fall. A couple more things you'll need for your boa's enclosure are the right humidity range and an adequate amount of ventilation. So in general, you want to aim for a humidity in the range of about 60 to 80% relative humidity. And one way you can achieve the right humidity is by misting. So I'll typically mist my boa cages about once a week when I'm servicing them. You can get these inexpensive spray bottles and you just spray them a few times in the mist setting. One of the things that has a large impact on the humidity of the enclosure is going to be your substrate choice, and some substrates have less humidity than others. I found that the most humid substrate is that coconut husk bedding. Aspen bedding is less humid, it provides less humidity, and then some of the paper substrates are the least humidity and the hardest to maintain humidity. If you don't maintain enough humidity, your boa can have issues with shedding its skin. And if your boa has stuck sheds or you have to soak your snake to get it to shed, you probably want to increase your humidity. So in general, as I mentioned, I use aspen and I find that's sufficient in humidity. For snakes that have issues with shedding, I typically move them onto the coconut husk. For example, sometimes my true red-tailed boas will have shedding issues, I think just because they're from a very high humid environment in the wild, in the Amazon rainforest. However, other snakes like my Tarahumara boas, which are from a drier climate, I've never had any shedding issues. If you have too much humidity, you'll notice that you'll see this like fogging up on the side of the cage, which tells you it's too much humidity. And you can get all kinds of health problems in your snake. You can get infections, you can get skin issues, you can get growth of mold. So you want to make sure you don't have too much humidity either. And then the other thing is ventilation. And ventilation, of course, has an influence on your humidity. If you don't have adequate ventilation, the humidity can be too high and you have issues with that. Some snake cages just don't have enough ventilation. It's almost like they're sealed, like they want to maintain that humidity, but you have issues with ventilation. If that's the case, you may need to drill or burn holes in the side of the cage using a soldering iron, just to make sure that you have an adequate amount of ventilation. You definitely want to have some airflow in the cage to prevent health problems in your boa. You also want to consider the maintenance of the cage when you're choosing what enclosure for your boa. I found that some of the plastic commercially available snake cages are actually relatively difficult to keep clean, just because snake wastes will stick to the sides of the cage, especially back in the corners, and sometimes even in grooves in the cage. And you might have to go back there with a scraper and scrape, and then use a vacuum to clean out the urates that build up, which is kind of a pain. I found that the tubs, I like using tubs in a rack system because they're so easy to clean and maintain. You also want to consider the aesthetics. So some cages just look better than others. So depending on your decor and how you want your snake room to look, you want to choose your cages wisely. And most of us, myself included, have kind of assembled their cages over the course of many years, buying different types of cages, and they unfortunately don't have all a uniform look. But if you can plan it from the beginning and choose the same snake cages, your snake room will probably end up looking much nicer with the aesthetics of the cages in mind. I want to give you a real quick tour of one of my tub setups. So this is in a Iris Boa tub. This is a 30 by 40 inch tub, and you can see I'm using aspen as a substrate. You can see the water dish in the corner. On the cool side, I have this cork bark hide that the snake can hide under. Then you can see I have a plastic hide that I made myself over the hot spot. And you can see we have the snake right there. That's a VPIT positive boa resting over the hot spot. And then real briefly, I'll just show you on the side of the rack there that the tub is on top of. That is a piece of FlexWatt heat tape that's mounted to the bottom of the enclosure to provide the hot spot. I have a few more things I want to say about caging, specifically the different types of cages, the commercially available snake cage versus the rack system versus the naturalistic vivarium. But in the interest of time, I'm going to save these topics for a future video. As always, I welcome any questions or comments you have, either in the comments below or feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for watching, and enjoy your boas.